With the rise of climate change, we're seeing more severe natural disasters each year, and the stats show that many communities impacted aren't getting the help they need. Let's dig in. According to the National Centers for Environmental Information, in 2021, there were 20 natural disasters exceeding $1 billion in damage each. Back in the 80s and 90s, we saw only a handful of these each year. To put this into perspective, we conducted our own analysis. We wanted to compare the two most recent decades on record. We looked at 2000 to 2010 and 2011 to 2021. Between those two periods, we saw a 96% increase in billion-dollar spending for major disasters. This is notable because Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005, which was the single most expensive disaster to date. With this increase in disasters, government aid is needed now more than ever. But a recent NBC analysis found that after these disasters, the Federal Emergency Management Agency often rejected aid to marginalized communities. The majority of the counties denied had poverty rates higher than the national average. To understand why this is, let's walk you through the aid application process. We sat down with Carlos Martin, a researcher at Brookings who studies the cost of natural disasters. As he points out, after a disaster, the governor of your state has to request a disaster declaration from the president that would allow residents to apply for FEMA's Individual Assistance Program, which helps the uninsured or underinsured.
When you're dealing with lower income people with lower resources, and people who live in historically disinvested communities, they're going to have a harder time. And those are the people that are most likely to need the aid.
But between fall of 2018 and fall of 2021, about 40% of declarations requested from governors were denied by FEMA. So people living in those areas were not eligible to apply for federal aid. When FEMA denies governors' requests, they often say the disaster was not severe enough, even if dozens of residents are left without a roof over their heads. The responsibility also falls on the states to help provide aid after disasters, but a lot of states don't have sufficient funding either.
People who were low income prior to the event, people who had low credit scores, for example, if they had a low credit score before the event, they're not applying for credit cards after the event, right? They're not getting all the potential buffers that they could, whether they're a good buffer, financial buffers or not.
With limited options, it can be difficult to meet basic needs. People have an even harder time if they don't own the place they live and have to wait for their landlord or property manager to rebuild their home. They face challenges finding somewhere to go in the meantime.
But if you're a renter, you're out of that apartment, and there aren't a whole lot of other apartments in your area because everything's been downed, right? If it's significant enough, most places have been damaged.
On the flip side, FEMA's National Advisory Council stated in a 2020 report that their recovery programs provide an additional boost to wealthy homeowners and others with less need, while lower income individuals and others sink further into poverty after disasters. That wouldn't be the first time they've been accused of that. A study from 2019 found that Hurricane Harvey survivors in Houston were less likely to receive grants if they lived in neighborhoods with more racial diversity compared to areas with more white residents and financial resources. We reached out to FEMA for their take on all of this, and they got back to us with this statement saying, "Advancing equity for all survivors, especially in those historically underserved and low-income communities, is our primary goal. We're leaving no stone unturned when it comes to helping socially vulnerable communities and survivors, and efforts that require statutory or regulatory changes are also on the table." There have also been bills introduced to deal with this issue. For example, Senator Dick Durbin and Senator Tammy Duckworth's Fairness in Federal Disaster Declarations Act, but it hasn't gained momentum. The goal of the bill is to reform FEMA's disaster declaration process to make it more equitable to small and rural communities. Durbin first introduced this bill in 2012 after FEMA denied aid to 2 counties in his home state of Illinois after an outbreak of tornadoes. There are so many expenses to consider here, and it's not just after storms hit. We also have to recognize the cost of evacuation and how expensive that can be. If you need a place to stay and don't have family or friends close by, you'll have to get a hotel and pay for food. Several studies have shown that about half of Americans do not have enough saved in case of a $1,000 emergency. Some people have no choice but to stay. All of these costs associated with disasters can leave people with nowhere to turn.
We have to think about all of the opportunities and spend the money before an event in these communities and for these households, rather than wait until the crisis.
Now we're bringing in Craig Fugate, former FEMA administrator under the Obama administration, to give us a little more context on this issue. Craig, thank you so much for joining us. Some reports we've seen show that low-income communities struggle to get assistance from FEMA after disasters. Why do you think this gap in aid exists?
Generally, in the response, it's less of a problem, but in rebuilding and doing the mitigation programs where we're hopefully rebuilding better, it often has been a challenge that smaller, poorer communities don't have the resources to manage these grants. In some cases where they're applying, they're competing with other communities. And then ultimately, there's a certain bias in the programs that look at dollars of risk avoidance rather than emphasizing impacts to people. And this is one of the things that the Biden administration and FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell are trying to address is how do we take an emphasis on how many dollars we save when we rebuild from future disaster losses to really focusing on reducing the impacts to the community and providing tools and resources to allow rural, small, and lower income communities to successfully compete for these grants.
Natural disaster survivors can turn to their state and federal government for help, but sometimes they struggle getting help from either. How does that shared responsibility between those two governing bodies actually work, and how can that process be improved as well?
Well, again, when we're talking about a federal disaster declaration, where we've turned on, the president has authorized assistance to families and individuals impacted by the disaster, it's about the uninsured losses. And so disproportionately, we know that people with lower incomes, people that don't have resources have a higher percentage of the uninsured losses. They're going to need more help. Yet the program seems to be, to the point where it's almost like 3 steps you have to go through. First thing is, did you have insurance? If you did, then there's not much assistance there. Second thing is, can you get a loan? And the Small Business Administration disaster loans, you get referred to there, and people are going, I can't afford a loan. Why are you making me go take out a loan? In some cases, it's to prove you can't afford the loan or don't qualify before FEMA provides the grant assistance. And so it's a complex process for people who've lost everything and say, I was told to call this number and you're telling me I got to fill out more forms. And so to me, it's one, making sure people are getting help. It was something that we started to try to do was, how much of this can we do for people so that they don't have to go through all this and get to the question that they need to know, can FEMA help them or not help them? And can we do that on the first call or the first time you contact us or the first time you meet with us? And we were starting to show some skill there of making early determinations, at least partial assistance to help people. But then what happens if there's not a presidential disaster? And I think this is where we find a lot of people we'll see flood, tornadoes, and other things that impact the state. The community gets hit hard, but there's no presidential disaster declaration. People say, why aren't you helping us? And it's because FEMA makes recommendations based upon the impact to the state, not to the individual community. And that's something, again, they're asking the question, well, what about small rural communities that may be in a big state, but the state doesn't have any programs for these people? What can FEMA do then? But I think it goes back to this question, what is the responsibility of state and local government to care for people that survive disasters versus the federal government, which was not designed to be the primary form of assistance, but in many cases is the only assistance available if it reaches the threshold where the president declares a disaster.
Craig Fugate is the former FEMA administrator under the Obama administration. Craig, thank you so much for providing this very valuable context to understanding how getting aid after a disaster works. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So we've talked a lot about how complicated it can be to get assistance to pick up the pieces after a natural disaster strikes. And that got us wondering, is there any way to better prevent this damage from happening in the first place? A new report from FEMA shows that many states have building codes that aren't strong enough to protect their buildings when disaster strikes. National correspondent Thomas Hoppaw tells us more about how states can work to strengthen these structures with the hopes of having less destruction after a disaster happens.
With the country seeing a flux in natural disasters destroying homes, a new report blames, in part, lax building codes in states that could have prevented damage from natural disasters.
Over 1,000 homes were destroyed and many businesses. About 30,000 people were evacuated from their home. Many people were at risk, and the fire just moved so quickly through town.
I feel like it's worse. I just feel like we hear more and more about these weather disasters.
A report from the UN's World Meteorological Organizations shows that natural disasters have increased by a factor of 5 over the past 50 years, mainly due to climate change. Whether it's damage from hurricanes, tornadoes, or other natural disasters, FEMA reported that 39 states were placed in the lowest category on strength of its building codes for residential and commercial buildings. 19 states received a score of 0, including some of the nation's most disaster-prone states like Louisiana and North Carolina.
So in our community, last October, actually, we adopted very contemporary energy codes. So we adopted the 2021 International Energy Efficiency Code. Of course, this climate disaster came through our community, and we saw firsthand the need for action.
FEMA has urged states and localities to adopt the newest building codes, often offering incentives like discounted flood insurance premiums, which is why communities across the country are trying to improve building codes from stronger and more fire-resistant home layouts and building materials, including roofs.
We've asked the staff to bring back a wildland-urban interface code that would be voluntary, and we've asked them to look for resources to help people afford to do it. So if we can incentivize people to do it, we will.
Here in Louisville, the Marshall Fire last year took more than 1,000 homes, and the mayor is trying to incentivize homeowners to build or update their homes to have green building codes, which usually also mean a building is less likely to burn. She's hoping for a push on a national level.
We're looking for grants and other help, but this is really a national issue. At the end of the day, when these disasters come through, when there's underinsurance, the federal government is who comes in and steps up with support. And it's kind of hard to understand why there's not more federal requirement around the code, because at the end of the day, the federal taxpayers, are paying to fix these problems.
Because there is no federal requirement, organizations like Wildfire Partners are focusing on educating people on the importance of updating their buildings.
What we do is we do one-on-one educational site visits with homeowners that we kind of go through the details of how to reduce the risk of their homes. It's everything from the roof to the siding to the eaves to the deck, and kind of going out from the house from there.
I'm Thomas Hopper reporting.